Charles Oliveira fights Mateusz Gamrot this weekend at UFC Rio, and with one legendary Brazilian UFC fighter winning last week with Alex Pereira knocking out Magomed Ankalaev at UFC 320, they look to win the main event 2 weekends in a row with UFC Rio. However, a lot of people are thinking that Mateusz Gamrot will pull this one off, and he's even the Vegas betting odds favorite right now at -128, with Charles Oliveira at around +100. Now, I know those are very close odds. You, I, and a lot of other people are likely Charles Oliveira fans. You might be a Gamrot fan, but most of you are probably Oliveira fans. But today we are going to face the potential sad reality of Charles Oliveira losing this fight, and what this would mean going forward for his UFC career and what would be left of it, if anything. So quick background into Charles Oliveira for those of you who don't know. Most of you probably do know, so we're going to speed run through this. But he started off his UFC career, he was known as a quitter. It was a very shaky start. He'd win some fights, but he lost more fights than he won. But then all of a sudden, he dyes his hair blonde, moves up to lightweight, and goes on this crazy winning streak. He becomes a UFC fighter with the most submission wins in history, and he wins the title, defends the title multiple times, and then he loses his title a few years ago to Islam Makhachev, who's the lightweight GOAT. At least that's my opinion. That's another video for another time, so if you want to see me break that down in the future, you might as well subscribe to the channel right now. But we'll get right back on topic. So after losing to Makhachev, he beats Beneil Dariush, and people are like, oh, Charles Oliveira's back, he's going to get his rematch. But then he loses to Arman Tsarukyan in a very close match. He almost choked out Arman twice in this match. But it was only 3 rounds, and Arman decided to just lay on top of Charles Oliveira, be a very boring wrestler, and win the fight. So sadly, Charles lost, but it was very, very close. And then he goes on to beat Michael Chandler. He dominated him for 5 rounds at the end of last year. I mean, the only offense that Michael Chandler had was just spamming hammer fists to the back of Oliveira's head, which is not a legal move in UFC, but the refs would just let him get away with it. It was like his only moment of hope that whole fight, but Charles Oliveira was dominating him. And then with Islam Makhachev moving up to 170, we had Charles Oliveira versus Ilia Topuria at UFC 317 for the vacant lightweight championship. This was Charles Oliveira's second title run he was going for right now. Everyone in his fan base was so stoked for this fight. You know, Ilia was moving up from a lower weight class, and although he was a monster, people thought that Charles had the experience and size needed to beat Ilia Topuria. But sadly, as we all know, this was not the case. He did almost have a heel hook on him, but he got brutally knocked out by Ilia like everybody else is getting, so you can't really fault him for that, but that's the current status of where we are now. That fight took place less than 4 months ago, and he had this quick turnaround. And who is he facing this weekend? Mateusz Gamrot. Now, Oliveira was not always supposed to fight Mateusz Gamrot this weekend. All along, it was agreed it was going to be Rafael Fiziev, who's a dangerous kickboxer. He fought Justin Gaethje recently. However, as according to the plan of Rafael Fiziev's fight camp every time, he gets injured. Unfortunately, you know, we hope that he's okay, but it is annoying to see him pull out with another injury. We got to get this guy stretching or figuring something out. But then Charles Oliveira is trying to find another fight because this just happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he's calling out everybody, even the people who are turning down the fight. But then Mateusz Gamrot agrees to the fight, and Charles Oliveira kind of backed off this and said that he didn't want that fight. Said he was training to fight a striker, but Mateusz Gamrot's a wrestler, so it's such a big switch this short before the fight, which I do understand. But if you're going to call everybody out for ducking, if someone accepts it, you got to take that fight. And he ultimately did take the fight. He did not duck Mateusz Gamrot. The Lion doesn't duck. And here he is this weekend fighting Mateusz Gamrot. And some of you guys may be asking, who is Mateusz Gamrot? Well, Mateusz Gamrot is a great wrestler, but he's a boring wrestler. He's one of those guys that just wet towels, who soaks everybody for 5 rounds, 3 rounds, whatever the fight is, and he's just going to win by decision, not going to do crazy damage, and it just is what it is. He's one of those guys, man. But I'll tell you what, he is good at it. He wins most of his UFC fights, and he has problems sometimes getting UFC fights because fighters are ducking him and turning down that fight offer. He lost a fight to Dan Hooker, and that's the fight that he should have won, but the judges gave it to Dan. Very controversial there. But he has wins over guys like Arman Tsarukyan, who's about to beat Dan Hooker next month and then fight for the title. Video coming out on that in a few weeks from now, so make sure you subscribe to see that when it drops, because that is going to be a crazy fight. And there's very important lightweight implications based on the outcome of that fight. So subscribe to make sure you don't miss that video. But Mateusz Gamrot also has wins over guys like Jalen Turner and Rafael Dos Anjos and Rafael Fiziev, who he replaced in this fight. So this guy has great wins, and he's a great wrestler. I think he's up there with the best wrestlers in the UFC, certainly the best wrestlers in the division, and we know that Charles has struggled with wrestlers in the past. Examples given, Islam Makhachev, Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan. So will he struggle the same with Mateusz Gamrot, or is this finally when Charles gets it done and beats him? And I will tell you that when people are ducking a fighter, it's normally for a reason. The UFC fighters know better about this than you, I, or anyone else watching the UFC does. If you're ducking somebody, it's likely because they're really good. I mean, think of the people who get ducked in recent UFC history. It was Khamzat Chimaev and it was Shavkat Rakhmonov. And both those guys are still undefeated in the UFC, beating everybody, and they look pretty dominant, except for Shavkat's last fight against Ian Gary. But all in all, Ian Gary's a good fighter, and both those wrestlers who were getting ducked are very dominant and very impressive in the UFC. So for Mateusz Gamrot to also be getting ducked, you must think he must be a pretty good fighter and someone who's really tough to beat in the UFC. Like, you know who's not getting ducked? Michael Chandler and Conor McGregor. Those guys' names get offered to you, you're taking that fight day one because those are easy matchups for top-ranked fighters that will propel you ahead because of the name value, because of the style matchup. They're not as good as they once were, so those are fighters you don't duck. But someone like Gamrot, Chimaev, Rakhmonov, you duck those names. You don't want to come across those names unless it's a title fight or it's going to boost you way up from where you were right now and you have a good style for them. And let me tell you, a lot of people in the UFC do not have good style for these guys. They're very well-rounded fighters who are very, very good wrestlers. And that is hard for anybody to beat. Wrestling right now is still the best base for MMA. And when you give these wrestlers a striking ability that Khabib didn't have, but you see Makhachev have it, you see Shavkat have it, that makes them that much better than everybody else and that much harder to beat. I mean, you see this happening with Merab now, and then you add Merab's crazy cardio and look what you have. By the way, we predicted that fight correctly, so anybody in the comments of my prediction video for that fight saying I was wrong, well, look what we have here. However, the topic of the video is what if Charles Oliveira loses this fight, and what I think he should do, honestly, is retire. And this is the Herrick Insider News for today. For those of you who don't know, I give this segment every video. It's insider news that you probably didn't know and wouldn't find elsewhere, and it helps put the whole video in context and give you guys niche news to provide value to my subscribers. And today's news is that Charles Oliveira just had a kid right around the Ilia Topuria fight, and so for Charles Oliveira to lose this fight totally eliminates another title run, and that is already seeming like a distant possibility. You gotta think it might be time for him to go spend time with his newborn and his other kids and his wife and just enjoy life rather than having to grind for these UFC fights. Because we know that Charles Oliveira weight cut is really bad, and we will touch on that in about 40 seconds from now. But his weight cuts are really bad. He's a big fighter for the division, and he's 36. He's past his prime at this point. I think you and I would both agree that Charles Oliveira is not the same Oliveira that he was when he was a champion. He's just not at the same high level that he is. He's still a very good fighter, but he's not the same peak that he was, that he would need to be at to be champion again. And if we're not fighting for a championship, what are we fighting for? Sure, there are some legacy fights left, and looking right now at who there is, I don't really know. There's not that many easy names at lightweight that are even relevant these days. There's Michael Chandler, but you already beat Michael Chandler twice. Like, you're not going to go run that back a third time, so I don't know who we're going to fight. If you move up to welterweight, that division is full of sharks. That is one of the most competitive divisions right now, and I think he loses to the champion as well as anybody in the top 9. I mean, we're talking from JDM all the way down to Michael Morales. Like, these fighters are all very good, and I think all of them would beat them. Even someone like Kamaru Usman and Joaquin Buckley, I think, still beat Charles Oliveira. But if you look at number 10, I think that is the best next matchup for Charles Oliveira if he loses this fight, is fighting Colby Covington. We know Colby Covington and Brazil have beef, so this would be a perfect rivalry to go into this fight. You could build it up. 2 huge names. You could throw it on any pay-per-view. Well, there won't be pay-per-views anymore, but you could throw it on any big fight, and it will make everybody tune in that much more. It will bring more fans into the event. But outside of that, I don't know where you go. I just don't see that many legacy fights left for Charles Oliveira at this age in the UFC. Maybe there's Gilbert Burns, but I know they're both Brazilian. At that point, it might be time for Oliveira to retire, if not after this fight against Gamrot. I mean, you have a future to think about. You have kids, and getting flatlined by Ilia and potentially this weekend, even though it's less likely, it makes it really hard to see, and you have to really think about your future and your health. If he does stay a lightweight after this fight, there is fights like Max Holloway and Paddy Pimblett, which would be entertaining fights everybody would watch. But I don't know how you're going to get that step up in competition, because both those fighters are ranked higher than Gamrot right now. I don't know how you're going to get that matchup after losing to Gamrot. That just doesn't make sense to me. And even if he did, I think he loses those fights, unfortunately. But if he wins, it would be cool to see him run back the Max matchup because they did fight before, you may not remember. They fought at featherweight, and that is when Charles Oliveira tore his esophagus early in the first round, and they had to just end the fight right there. So we never really got to see them fight, and they're both so much bigger names right now and different fighters that it would be awesome to see that fight play out before Charles gets too old. And that could be a great fight to propel Max after that win, which he would likely win, propel him into a #1 contendership spot, ready to fight for the belt again. But if Charles retires, what could he do? In the MMA world, he could coach. We've seen him coach before. He coached Ian Gary in his fight against Shavkat Rakhmonov. And to Charles' credit, he had Ian Gary looking very good in the grappling department. I mean, we all thought Shavkat was a way better grappler and wrestler than Ian Gary, which I still think he is. But Ian Gary almost choked out Shavkat. Like, that is very impressive, and I think a lot of that was due to Charles Oliveira. Ian Gary even gave Charles a lot of praise for helping him out. So I think Charles does have a future in coaching if he wants to, and it's something I could really see him doing with how good of a technician he is in jiu-jitsu. Now, I don't think that Charles Oliveira will go the increasingly popular route of going into boxing. I just don't think his style permits it. He is a good striker, but he doesn't really have a super great boxing style. And with his chin getting weaker and him getting older, I do not think he should go into boxing. But these jiu-jitsu tournaments and grappling matches are on the rise, so maybe that's something he gets into because that is his area of expertise. So that would be something cool to see him navigate, but only time will tell. I'm sure he'll spend time with his family and kids if he does retire. But again, we'll have to see. You know, if he wins, what do we get? Now let's look at this side of the argument. What if Charles Oliveira beats Mateusz Gamrot? What if he wins? What do we do there? Is this title run 3.0? 2.0 is supposed to happen after he had his second kid, but I don't know if 3.0 is going to happen. There's so many contenders at lightweight. Charles Oliveira turns 36 less than a week after this fight this weekend. And with him being out of his prime in his late 30s, with this many contenders and this good of contenders, I think that a late 30s title run for Charles Oliveira at lightweight or any weight division is just really unfeasible. And he used to fight at featherweight, but at this age, he's not cutting back down to that weight, especially with how hard it is for him to make lightweight. So I think Charles Oliveira, even if he wins, would still need 2 more good wins, and that would put him at 37 or 38 years old at that point, and that would be really hard to do a title run with how good these guys are today in the UFC. But that's just my opinion. We may have a prediction video later this week, so if you're interested, let me know down below and subscribe to see that. We post multiple UFC videos every week. This is where you get the new content. We finally got a decoration in the new apartment right here, so that's very exciting. You guys let me know if you want to see any sort of decorations in this room. But with that being said, let me know down below, could Charles Oliveira win, or do you think he loses to Mateusz Gamrot this weekend? And I'll see you guys in the next video later this week. Deuces.